Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are once again updating the Survivor 42 power rankings following episode 11, also known as the Do or Die round. Funny how that happened, considering I made a video about Do or Die not too long ago, and obviously we'll have to wait until the end of the season to see what would have happened had Lindsay gone out that way, since, well, she survived Do or Die. But for now, we just have these power rankings to consider. But as usual, I'll be ranking each player based on how likely it is that they'll win the game from this point. But without further ado, let's get right into the list. So starting off at number 7, we have the boot from this week, and here we have Drea. And it's not too surprising to see Drea go out in this spot, considering how big of a character she was, how big of a player she was over the course of the season, the similarities between her and Shan from 41 in terms of their archetype. And even with all these advantages in play, it sort of makes sense for her to go out through this way of her misplaying her knowledge as power, and as a result not being able to get through it. But obviously she was propped up as a pretty big threat throughout a lot of this episode, with people talking about the need to get her out now, particularly Omar and Mike. And we see that play out where there is the plan to get rid of her at this tribal. However, she does plan to use her knowledge as power to steal Mike's idol. However, we see her tell Omar about her advantage, which allows him to counter it by telling Mike about it, and then getting Mike to give him and Lindsay his idol, so that when we get to tribal, she uses the knowledge as power and fails to successfully get the idol, which is a bit similar to what we got in 41, where Liana was also tried to steal Xander's idol, but because Xander knew about it, he was able to counter it. However, this probably wasn't as satisfying. Mind you, there's probably less setup for this, as it was made pretty clear on the show that everyone knew about Liana's knowledge as power on 41, with Shan literally being the one to spill the beans there. While this, we literally see Drea hold on to it for several rounds and really only tell Omar about it right before tribal. And obviously we have Omar briefly mention potentially getting Mike's idol from him, and obviously that ends up playing out. So admittedly, it comes a bit out of nowhere and obviously isn't as big of a moment, especially considering the fact that Drea and Mike aren't the same rivals that Liana and Xander were back in 41, so there's that element as well. And again, considering the fact that so much of her story throughout the season was based around her advantages and the fact that she had so many, it sort of makes sense that she goes out in a way that involves some of her advantages, and particularly misplaying them, in this case misplaying the knowledge as power, and then in turn using her extra vote to try to get the votes on the mic, but is unsuccessful in doing so, and obviously she goes out as a result. And I do think she played a pretty good game on the whole. I mean, there are still some issues. Like, I feel like by the end of it, I felt like Omar was more in the center of things than her, and obviously she was seen as a pretty big threat at the end of the day. And obviously you can point to certain issues with her game, like the fact that she needed an idol during the double tribal. But for the most part, I feel like she played a pretty solid game, and she's here at number 7. And with that, we now have 6 people left in the game, and only 2 episodes left before the end of the season, which is pretty exciting. But as usual, I'll be ranking these remaining players based on how likely it is that they'll win the game from this point. But at number 6, the person I think is the least likely to win Survivor 42 from this point is Romeo. And once again, I do have him at the bottom of the power rankings. And admittedly, I didn't think he was going to go home this episode. I mean, while the edit did dunk on him a bit with them talking about how he's an easy target, and also the whole rice eating stuff literally happening right after we hear him talking about being an underdog with Marion, is pretty funny, but also shows just how dead in the edit he is. And once again, he doesn't seem to be too involved in things, where he even votes incorrectly once again, instead voting for Mike along with Drea there, completely left out of the plan. Granted, this is a bit more warranted, as Drea was someone he was technically close with at one point, but even she was starting to distance himself from him after the merge, so even then it more so reflects his lack of awareness in the game. Although I have heard some people say that this could also be a way of countering the shot in the dark in case that were to come into play. But considering he did vote for Mike, that means that even if like Drea played the shot in the dark, that he would just be voting out Mike there. So there's that. But at the end of the day, he still left on the bottom, and the edit has just been so negative for him that I don't really see how he wins the game. I can definitely see him getting to the end of the game, as I alluded to in previous weeks. It's just that the edit is not there for a win, and because of that, I have him here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have another person who has been getting a lot of negative content lately, and definitely someone who could have been in danger this past round, but they won immunity. And here we have Jonathan. And again, this was another mostly negative episode for Jonathan, where yes, we do hear him talk a lot about how he's big and how he needs to eat a lot of calories. And the fact that he doesn't get those calories means that it's hard for him to get energy. And obviously, people note how skinny he's gotten and how much muscle mass he's lost. But even so, we see that get that scene of him getting really crabby when the others are trying to fish, and he feels like he's being forced to explain himself when he feels like he shouldn't. And again, it's just a really bad look for him at the end of the day. Plus, he's still a pretty big target moving forward. I mean, it made sense for him to compete in the challenge, and obviously, while the challenge wasn't quite in his wheelhouse, he was able to pull out the win there, escape do or die when he was literally the only other person to play aside from Lindsay. So he does get that, and he is included on the plan. But I feel like at this point, the edit has done enough to undermine him between showing how bad he is strategically, particularly during the double tribal, and also people just getting annoyed by him, particularly people like Lindsay getting annoyed by him as well. And of course, there's his sort of one-sided rivalry with Marion, so there's that as well. And I feel like those are all things that are going to come back to bite him at some point, whether he like gets voted out after failing to win immunity, or even if he gets to the end, even if he does win out from this point and gets to the end, I can see people like really being upset with him, people not really respecting his game, people really seeing him as someone that only wins challenges while being somewhat lacking in the other areas, which, to be fair, isn't entirely true. I think he is good socially at points, and I think he is somewhat aware strategically. It's just that I feel like his perception is that he is largely physical, and he hasn't really done too much to waver that, and just comes off as a domineering alpha male despite his awareness to the contrary. So I feel like both from an in-game perspective and even from an edit perspective, I feel like he's really been undermined to where I don't feel like he's the winner at this point. And because of that, I'm here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4. And I did consider moving this person up to number 3, but I feel like just throughout the course of the season, this person has not had the storylines to really justify having it too much higher. And here we have the survivor of Do or Die. We have Lindsay. And I'll say up front that I was kind of tricked here. I actually thought coming into this that she was going to die through Do or Die. I mean, some of this goes back to 41, where we saw Deshawn survive Do or Die. And considering the odds, I felt like there was a decent chance that with this twist coming back in 42, that the person who had to do it would ultimately get the bad option there. And especially once we got into the episode, once we saw it be Lindsay, and once we saw her content spike after the challenge and really getting an intro package there, it all just made me feel really bad about her prospects. And yes, while we did get a decent amount of scrambling before the tribal, particularly with the Drea planet coming together, and Lindsay even having a bit of a role in that, I just felt like in the back of my head that a lot of this was just going to be set up for the final 6 and possibly the finale, like more so than anything that's going to pan out in this episode. I felt like it really was going to culminate with Lindsay going out here. And to be fair, I was wrong here, and I'm actually pleasantly surprised to be wrong here. I'm glad Lindsay didn't go out through Do or Die. Because I think Do or Die is a stupid twist, and I'm glad we didn't have to see someone have their game come to an end because of it. So I am glad Lindsay was able to pull it out there. Now, granted, she was in a pretty bad spot anyway, with her being the only other person to compete in the challenge, which, is a bit of a bad move in the sense that, she didn't need to do it. I mean, unless she really wanted to get out Jonathan this round, which even then she wasn't able to do. And obviously, you can question whether she should have gone to the challenge, which I think she probably shouldn't have. But I am glad that she ultimately survived it. So there's that at least. In terms of her moving forward, I mean, she did get an idol from this episode because with Drea coming out and she being the only remaining person with an amulet, that amulet is now an idol that she can now use up until the final 5. So that is something to her credit, at least. And I feel like that is something that can be useful for her moving forward. The question is whether she'll have the chance to play it, or if she'll even have the chance to get to the end, because I feel like she is someone who, in theory, should be well positioned to get towards the end. However, I feel like there's a couple things. One is that, yes, they were able to get Mike's idol through that deal in order to get around the knowledge is power. And obviously, they have the potential to keep that idol moving forward. However, I feel like regardless of what her or Omar do moving forward, I feel like it'll definitely paint a target on their back, especially if Jonathan ends up winning a bunch of immunities heading forward. I feel like that actually might put Lindsay in a pretty dangerous spot. And I feel like she is someone who could be perceived as a jury threat, especially if Omar is, say, able to vote out Mike, not giving up his idol, and in turn burning Mike's jury vote. If Omar comes to be perceived as someone who has been burning jury members, Lindsay could be seen as the next biggest threat, and as a result could be taken out. So that's a bit of a worry. Even though she has been getting a content spike in recent episodes, I feel like it just isn't enough at this point. I feel like if she were the winner, she would have gotten a bit of a more consistent presence from earlier in the season. I feel like she would have gotten more credit. And even in her context bite, I mean, there was that moment last week where we actively see her not finding the idol, even though it was relatively near her where she was looking. So that's another knock as well. And even though she does survive do or die here, I feel like that is something that could potentially contribute to her resume and her becoming an even bigger threat moving forward. How she could have the story to tell at the end of how she went toe to toe with Jonathan in order to put her game on the line and then ultimately took that risk and came out on top. I feel like that could be a compelling story for her to tell, even more so than what Deshaun had to offer when he survived do or die. So I feel like there's a lot of problems in game for Lindsay moving forward, even though she has some tools to get around it. I feel like at the end of the day, there are just other people that are more likely to win based on the edit. And I feel like even in game, there could be a debate for her becoming a big threat, which is a big reason I have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and even though this person is staying in the same spot, I feel like my overall view of this person has gone down, and here we have Mike. And it's crazy because for a lot of the season, I did think Mike was a top contender, and to be fair, I mean, it's that assessment and what we saw was enough to establish him as a pretty big character, and sure enough, he's here in the end game. However, I feel like over the last couple weeks, I mean, we just been getting more and more stuff that just made me think he's probably not the winner. I mean, some of this is in game with us learning about his perception from the exit interviews. People like Chanel and Hi Now are talking about how Mike is seen as emotional and someone that votes emotionally. To be fair, that did also come across in the show, like with him trying to vote out Chanel shortly after the merge. Like that really came off as a personal vendetta over something that was purely strategic. So that's not great. But obviously the fact that this stuff is being reinforced in the exit interviews, and it's just not great at the end of the day. So there's that. And of course, there was his edit in the previous episode where, yes, we did get to hear his strategy from his perspective, but it's a strategy that probably isn't ideal at the stage of the game where he's talking about wanting to be seen as Omar's puppet, wanting Omar to think that he is his puppet, which again, if this were like the pre-merge, if like, or something like that, or even if it was the beginning of the merge, I feel like hearing about this, it's like, okay, he's going to do this, gonna allow some of these more crazy votes to happen, but secretly work in the background so that he can eventually make his move around, well, now. But the fact that we're hearing it now at the final 8, like pretty late in the game, probably isn't ideal, and it's really not going to give him that much time to make his own move. And even if he does make a big move, then he's not going to have enough time to really highlight how this was an intentional strategy on his end, or how he was able to do stuff beforehand. So I feel like from an in-game perspective, him talking about being a puppet just isn't ideal. And then we get to this episode where we see, yes, Mike taking some credit for the high boot, but we also see Omar taking a decent amount of credit as well. And we even have Omar undercut Mike by calling him the new high, which is not ideal at all. And I feel like just the more that I think about it, the more that I'm starting to think maybe Mike isn't the winner. I mean, I know that there are warning signs, and I know that I didn't reflect them as much in these rankings these past couple of weeks, but I feel like just as more time passes and we're continuing to see more of this negativity, it's just making me feel less and less confident about Mike. Now, to his credit, I mean, he could be the next boot. I mean, especially with the idol in Omar's hands, which, by the way, I mean, that was a pretty nice TV moment there with him getting to pass off the idol to Omar and like have that moment of saying no to Drea when she asked for the idol. I felt like that was at least a somewhat interesting TV moment. But I feel like outside of that, like his fate is essentially now in Omar and Lindsay's hands, where on one hand, they could decide to not give back the idol, possibly voted him out there, and obviously that would be the end of his game. But even if he does get the idol back, I mean, yes, he could probably play it on himself or possibly get manipulated again into misplaying it. And I feel like at this point, he could get to the end. Like, I feel like if he isn't the next boot, and if Omar and Lindsay do decide to trust him and try to go all the way with him, then Mike could get towards the end game. Now, granted, it may not necessarily be with Omar and Lindsay. I mean, it could be with, say, Omar and Marianne, or Lindsay and Marianne, or some combination of that. However, I feel like at this point, it's just harder to see how he actually wins a jury vote, especially with this negative perception of him being emotional. And I feel like while I have downplayed that in previous weeks, I feel like now that we're actually getting towards the end game, now that we're really starting to see this become a major issue, I feel like I have to reflect it in my overall assessment. So while he isn't going down in my overall rankings, I mean, he still has that edit. He still has the potential to reach the end game, where I feel like Lindsay is someone who probably has less chances of getting to the end in a position to win a jury vote, even though she is seen as his big threat. However, it's just the fact that Mike's been undercut in recent weeks, and there are real legitimate jury concerns that makes me put him here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we have the same talk to as last week, and I feel like these are the main contenders coming into this end game. I feel like these two are the most likely to win the game. And at number 2, I actually have the same person from last week, and here we have Omar. And I've said this multiple times now, I'm a broken record, that Omar, to me, feels like he has been getting such a perfect edit for so much of the season. And I felt like for the longest time, he was a decoy winner. Now, granted, I felt like such a decoy winner probably would have been taken out around the final 8 or the final 7, maybe. Like, certainly not making it to final 6. I felt like that could have led to a more quote unquote chaotic endgame as a result. So the fact that he has made through it some of these pivotal rounds where people like him that were so blatant of a winner from the beginning of the season probably would have been taken out is something to consider. Now, mind you, I still think there are danger spots for him. Like, I feel like this latest move of, like telling Mike about Drea's power and then getting him to hand the idol off to him so that they can counteract that and then getting the idol is a pretty big move. However, I feel like it also opens up the door for him to be targeted moving forward, as obviously he's going to have to be faced with whether to give Mike the idol back for one, but also just people generally perceiving him as a big player. I mean, Drea was very open about how Omar was the one to orchestrate all this, so that's definitely a concern for Omar's end. It's just a matter of whether people are willing to flip on him at this point. And I think there could be some people that could do it. I mean, maybe maybe Omar could drop the ball and not giving Mike his idol back, and then maybe Mike orchestrates a flip. Maybe something like that. Maybe the storyline of Marion flipping on Taku could finally come to a head, and her using her idol to potentially idol out Omar, assuming Omar does give the idol back, and maybe Lindsay doesn't play her idol at this tribal, or maybe plays it on herself. That's a concern as well. I feel like there are definitely opportunities at this final 6 vote coming up to take out a big jury threat. And I feel like that definitely puts Omar into the firing line as well as Lindsay. I'll be very interested to see how he navigates that. So there's that. And I feel like even if he gets beyond that, I feel like Final Four firemaking could also be a potential danger point for him, where maybe they really are committed to this quote unquote decoy winner all the way to the Final Four firemaking, maybe setting him up so that he would win a jury vote if he gets to the end, ultimately gets taken out, and then as a result, maybe someone else wins. So I feel like that's another danger point for him. But also, I'll say that there is also a chance that he could lose a jury vote. Now, granted, I think that's the least likely of these three scenarios I am presenting here. I feel like Omar, generally speaking, has played a solid game, and I think people may come around to respect him at the end. However, there aren't any guarantees in this game. I feel like the biggest problem for Omar coming to a jury vote is the perception that he's this nice guy and would be incapable of making such big moves. And I feel like that could harm him to a certain extent. However, I also feel like it is more likely that he gets taken out for being seen as a big threat earlier on in the game. So that's another concern as well. So there are still some danger points in Omar's game here, particularly the final six and the final four. However, I feel like, again, he has continued to get a pretty strong edit throughout, and he has established himself as the best player this season, in my personal opinion. He has played a relatively dominant game, and I'm sure I'll have plenty to say about him when it comes time for this player ranking at the end of the season. However, there are still the concerns about him being too obvious of a winner, and plus the person at number one I feel like could be seen as a bit more of a curveball for some viewers, but I feel like there is enough there to establish that person as being number one. But all things considered, I feel like Omar still has played a pretty solid game. The fact that he even has gotten to this point, despite my concerns of him being a decoy, is impressive in its own right. It's just those concerns that maybe there is a downfall coming that leads me to put him here at number two. And now, at number one, the person I think is the most likely to win Survivor 42 at this point is Marianne. And I feel like this was a good enough episode for her. Particularly, the scene that stands out to me the most is the scene earlier in the episode where she talks about how this is a fun experience and how she really wants to have fun during her time here. And that to me really jumped out as something that could make her a potential winner. And I feel like in general, she has this good storyline. I mean, she isn't overexposed like Omar is. I feel like that is something that makes me put Omar lower. But the fact that Marianne does get a consistent checkup and has stuff that can be turned into a winner edit, despite her not being that important to the story, is something at least. And I feel like she has less potential for a downfall than Omar is, where, again, there's still the storyline of her flipping on Taku. I feel like Final Six coming up could be that point, particularly with Omar and Lindsay now in a integral position, possibly in a spot where they could upset Mike, causing him to flip. And even that storyline in the episode of her and Romeo talking about them being underdogs, that's another great moment for Marion. And while we see Romeo get undercut immediately with like the whole rice thing and people targeting him, I mean, I feel like that is still pretty good for Marion. I feel like that could be a defining moment for Marion's endgame here, where she could come out of nowhere and really, like scrape her way through the bottom, take out all the big power players, and then come in on top. So I feel like that's another big boon for her edit. And obviously she has her idol that nobody knows about. That's something that can be turned into potentially a power play as well. So I feel like there's less opportunities for Marion to be voted out in the end game than someone like Omar or Lindsay or really anyone left in the game. But she still has the strong content, this content that is positive, isn't overbearing, and stuff that can very well lead to a win. And I feel like that is a big reason I have Marion in such high regard. Now, I should probably disclose at this point that I don't actually think Marion's played that great of a game. I'm sure plenty of people will point out how she's been at the bottom for a lot of the game. Like, she has been at the bottom of Taku during the pre-merge. Even in the post-merge, like, while she is technically in the majority alliance, like, she isn't integral to things. And I feel like Omar, on the whole, has played a pretty strong game. So, again, if this were purely a gameplay ranking, I feel like Omar's clearly number one. I feel like Omar would be the most satisfying winner from a gameplay perspective, while I feel like Marianne has not played that impressive of a game. But I feel like there is still a chance that she can win a jury vote, and I feel like the edit is backing her up. So I feel like even though Marianne has not played that great of a game, I feel like she is someone that can very well win it, and I feel like she is someone that is more likely to win than Omar at this point. So because of that, I have her here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. As usual, I'll be back next week to break down the power rankings again. It's sort of crazy that we're getting towards the finale at this point. I mean, the finale is literally in less than 2 weeks, so that should be pretty fun to break down, as well as the end game. Stay tuned for that. Also covering the circle right now. That season's going on, so stay tuned for more videos on that. And I do plan to make more general Survivor videos moving forward. I did make my do or die video not too long ago, and I do have more video ideas like that, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.